Tonight, we're honored to have Bryan Bates as our speaker. Bryan has been fortunate to research the astronomy and cultural knowledge of the Navajo and Hopi. He has measured and recorded numerous archaeological sites across the Southwest, spent innumerable hours in libraries reading native ethnographies and archaeology, and more importantly, learned from and made friends with several native peoples whom he deeply respects. Tonight, Bryan will share his research at Wupatki National Monument, Chaco Canyon National Historical Park, and Mesa Verde National Park. So with this introduction, if you're ready to take it away, Bryan, go ahead and start sharing your screen. And
okay, let's see, how do I guess I have to do this. How's that looking?
Oh, that's perfect. You got it first try.
Okay, so I got to go back. First of all, when I was presenting last month, Ellie Large was in the audience, and she got excited because I started talking about this site that's over near Stoneman Lake, for the reason that it's primarily related to women's ceremonies. So I made a little shift today, and if Ellie is here, I hope you enjoy it, in that instead of taking you to Mesa Verde, where I did a lot of research and found that the alignment we thought existed was not actually a cultural astronomy site. And that's what happens when you do the science. You can have a hypothesis, but then you gather your information and you follow what the information says. And we concluded that what we thought was a marker for the southern maximum excursion of the moon was indeed not a marker. And we ticked off a few people doing that because it had been previously published that it was. Short of a long, what I want to do tonight is to give you a basic overview of how astronomy and science can help improve the probability of survival of a native culture or anybody, and to create some conversation at the end and help you understand what we can learn from Native American people. So that's me at the site near Stoneman Lake. We'll come back to. A little bit on astronomy. First of all, here's the east-west line, and here is our observer. So our observer can watch a star, maybe it's the sun, maybe it's a different star, maybe it's a planet, maybe it's the moon, migrate across the sky and then set. And of course, depending upon where we are in our orbit, will determine on what constellations, what star patterns we can see. In addition, it determines the altitude of the sun changes because of the Earth's orbit about the sun. So this is from the observer's perspective. But if we step out into the International Space System, space station, then what begins to happen is that we can see the Earth, and the Earth is actually orbiting about the sun, if you all can see my pointer. And in the middle here is the sun, so that yellow dot is the sun. And we're going to start at this point, which is the spring equinox, which we are coming up on. In fact, right about now, we're in this position. We're located there. But if we go from the spring equinox, equal days, equal nights, then as we travel along, we're changing our inclination with the sun. And we come to the summer solstice, the longest day of the year, obviously. And then from there, we end up decreasing in daylight, decreasing in the amount of time we'll see the sun. And we come over to the autumnal equinox, which is going to have the same declination, if you will, I should say, the same azimuth as the vernal equinox. And in fact, every time if the Earth is here, then you move across, it will have the same position relative to the horizon as it comes around the Earth's orbit. We come on down to the winter solstice, and that, of course, is the shortest day of the year, the least amount of light, and we'll come back to the equinox. But now we're going to go halfway between, let me start with the winter solstice. If we go halfway between the winter solstice and the equinox, we come to a date known as February 2nd. And you say, well, that's Groundhog's Day. And indeed it is, because that's a time in which some of probably the female groundhogs are coming up because they've been feeding their young. They're hungry, so they wake up, they come out to get something to eat, and then go back in for hibernation. I can explain more about that later, but let's move on. Halfway between the vernal equinox and the summer solstice is May 1st, or May Day. And what happens at these cross quarter points that I'm talking about is that that's the point in time in which we, as humans, will notice that the days are getting longer or shorter more quickly. So it's a change in the rate of change. Does that make sense to you? It's like an inflection point on a graph. So May 1st is one. That's, of course, May Day. And you may or may not know that May Day used to be outlawed in England because it was a little too lascivious. As we come around here, we come to August 6th. Romeo and Juliet. Remember, Romeo climbed up to spend the night with Juliet. They had a wonderful evening. The next morning he says, oh, I got to get out of here before your dad wakes up. So he climbs down, and Romeo says, when shall I see you again? And Juliet said, come on the, or wait a minute. Juliet asked when she would see Romeo again. He said, a fortnight from Lammas. So Lammas is from the old England, Northern European, and that's a cross-quarter date. There is also one with the Hopi. And then down here, most of you can probably figure out what the cross-quarter date is. It's halfway between September 21st and December 21st, and that date would be October 31st. And of course, that's Halloween. So that gives you a little bit of the astronomy that we're going through, so you can understand the changing position of the sun and so forth. I want to orient you to where we are. Here is Flagstaff. Most of you are probably living down here along the Mogollon Rim. Here's Gallup, Albuquerque, Cortez, Kayenta. I'm going to start over here at Chaco, which is right in this region here. And from Chaco, we'll go over here to Wupatki National Monument. And then from there, we'll drop down to the Stoneman Lake site. That's down right in this area, just off the rim of the Colorado Plateau. This is a painting by a very good Hopi friend of mine. His name is Filmer Kiwanyama. And this is the Hopi calendar. This is the Ahaha and Ahode Katsina. It's two Katsinas painted together as one. This is one side, that's the other. Those are the two Katsinas that are principally responsible for marking the movement of the sun and for announcing different ceremonies. This is Iatoto. Iatoto is one of the Katsinas that accompanies the sun year-round. So you see Iatoto here, just past the winter solstice. You also see him down below, just around summer solstice. Then we have Black Maiden, who is one who is watching the night. We have Corn Woman, who comes out and announces the return of spring. And that is the beginning of the Puwamuya ceremony. Now, in Hopi, everything is marked by the sun. Excuse me, I said that wrong. Everything is marked by the moon. And so as of the last first moon, which I forgot to check, but it would have been around probably February 10th, is a time that they would have started the Puwamuya ceremonies. and it's with the first crescent of a new moon. In that process, the Katsinas will return to the Hopi villages. And here is one of the Katsinas that is returning from the San Francisco peaks, following the rainbow path. And then they are preparing to plant corn. So this is then the the equinox right here, this white line. As we come on down, there is the eagle, and that represents respecting all life. There is the men who are putting corn pollen or some form of good wishes onto the growth of the plants. Here, the corn. This is the corn mana. And as we come around, Iatoto is monitoring the movement of the sun. The kiva is right here. You can see the ladder of the kiva coming up. And it is known that within the kiva, from time to time, there would be the head shaman would be sitting and looking out through the opening of the two rails forming the ladder and watching the movement of stars through the ladder as an indication of hourly time. So the Hopis are very, very much aware of the different times of the year. As we come over here, we come to the snake dance, and the snake dance is performed every other year. This is the antelope dance, which is performed on the years in which the snake dance is not. And both of them are then preparing for the harvest, preparing for the coming cooler weather. They are then collecting, of course, the food, preparing a feast. And then as we move past the equinox, the fall equinox, we come into the, this is the time of Lala Kantu, excuse me, I think it's Momsra. And what ends up happening is that this is one of the times of weddings. And then from the weddings, we go into the Wutsum, which is the men's rite of passage. And as we come, and the men's rite of passage begins around the October 31st, the cross quarter date. So it's the new moon associated with that date. And then we come back around to the winter solstice. So that's a very quick pathway through Hopi calendar year. Now, a couple of things I'm going to do this evening is I want you to understand that in order for us to determine whether or not there is a site that is culturally significant, we first have to look at the ethnographic evidence. So you might think that the first thing I do is go out and look at light shadow interactions on petroglyphs or through small windows, but actually it's to go to the library and understand the cultural time calendar of the people that we're working with, that I'm researching. Then when I'm on site, I have to ask myself, can the observer actually anticipate a certain point in time? And that's important because you know that we can have warm weather during February or March, and somebody may say, oh, it's time to go plant my corn, it's time to plant my beans. And sure enough, you plant them, and what happens? They sprout, they come up, and bang, we get hit with a snowstorm, freezing temperatures. So can you anticipate changes in time via the site that you're looking at? The last thing, and one of the more challenging things, is to try to understand how the information was used within the culture that you're working with, because that really then helps you begin to create a cultural classification reference, understanding their thought patterns, their observations, and how it's related then to the natural cycles of the earth. We're going to start at Chaco Canyon. Many of you have probably been there, but I doubt that you saw it under when it was this condition, because this picture was taken in 1896. This was part of the Hyde expedition from the American Museum of Natural History. George Pepper and Richard Wetherill, you've probably heard of Wetherill. That's the same family that found the Mesa Verde. At any rate, they excavated 189 rooms. But look at the building, look at Pueblo Bonito, and you can tell that a lot of this has had to been reconstructed. And that's an important point, because if it's reconstructed, we're interpreting what is the most probable construction of the site, not necessarily what the site actually was. This is Chaco Canyon in, I think it was the mid 1920s, 1930s. This photograph was taken by Charles Lindbergh, who, by the way, took a lot of photographs for a fellow named Emil Houry. And Emil Houry started the College of Archaeology and Anthropology at the University of Arizona. So the point behind this is that this now has been fully excavated and largely reconstructed. So this is what you would see today, but this picture was taken in the 1920s or so. It was after he had flown across the Atlantic Ocean. Very brief timeline. Earliest known buildings are up on Calapa. I forget the name of it, but there's a mesa just to the south of Fajada Butte, the visitor center. But the earliest buildings there were 550 AD. Then Chaco becomes more and more populated, and it's really an economic center as well as a ceremonial center. A lot of turquoise was found in the region. And so turquoise was probably the currency, the money that was being used. Chaco was very, very dependent upon dispersed farming. And not far from Chaco, of course, is the Continental Divide. So you get rainfall in different areas. Well, what ends up happening is that during this time of 800 to 1050, you go through several different droughts. Those droughts probably set up warfare, not within families, but between different communities. And how do we know this? Is that oftentimes we'll find different pottery that marks where there has been conflict between different groups of people. There was a social hierarchy that's pretty well documented at Chaco, and this social hierarchy probably created a fair amount of distrust. In some ways, we're seeing the same thing in our country at this point. Chaco is pretty much abandoned by 1100 AD. People have left. They've gone to Aztec. They've gone to the Rio Grande Valley. They've gone west to Hovenweep. But Chaco is pretty well abandoned. And there's a great book. It's called Anasazi America. I forget the author, but if you haven't read it, I recommend it to your reading. So we're at Chaco. This is Una Vida, and I put this slide in for two reasons. Number one, it frames Fajada Butte, which is where we're going. But secondly, I want you to look at the thickness of these walls and the structure of those walls. You can see that there's a very fine veneer right along the walls, and that it's more cobble filled in the middle. But look how thick they are and how tall they are. So this gives us a lot of information about the fact that there had to be some social engineering going on, as well as building engineering. It's anticipated that the men were probably bringing a lot of this rock off the top of the mesa, which is off the picture here up behind us, and that the women were probably doing a lot of the rock laying, but also sanding these rocks, making them fit very, very well, and then placing them. So the women were probably doing a lot of the construction of these buildings along with the men. This is Fajada Butte. Many of you have probably been to Chaco. If you haven't been there, get there. Richard, maybe you can set up a field trip and I'd be delighted to join you if that could happen. But at any rate, this is near the visitor center, and we were walking across this salt plain, salt, because this is all marine sediment, and as it's broken down and eroded, it's left some of the salts behind. We come around the back side here in order to come up, but as we come up, we'll come across here, and you can just kind of see how you can zigzag back and forth right through there. You see that? And then right here is the solar calendar site, the sun dagger. And we'll take you up there in just a minute. But first, we got to send the ranger first. And there's two reasons for that. Number one, you probably know this, there's been a resident rattlesnake that's lived down here for years. I've seen it 3 different times of the 4 times that I've gone up there. But the other thing is, you'll see that there's fencing up here. And so the ranger has the key to unlock it, because there were a lot of folks that were going up to this site and they were beginning to destroy it. So the Park Service says, no, we're controlling what goes on up there. This is the 3 slab site. This is the sun dagger site. And I want you to, in your mind, take these rocks and fold them back together. Just come from each side and push them together. Now lift them up. And as you lift them up, fit them right back up here into this crack. You can just barely see it, but there's a pretty good sized crack there. And those rocks are sitting up there, and then maybe it was a rainstorm, maybe it was thunder, something happened, and bam, these rocks fell down, hit the ground, and split apart. So that's the most likely way that these rocks got into this position. Now, this is my friend Andy Odell. Andy was a physicist and astronomer. He helped me understand all the astronomy that was going on that I needed to understand. I tried to help him understand the cultural behind it. And between the two of us, we drank a lot of beer. Well, Andy passed away about 2 years ago, so I want to commemorate this slide presentation to Andy Odell. This next picture is going to be looking right through this channel, and what I want to do is, this is rock 1, rock 2, rock 3. So this is channel 1 right there, and this is channel 2. And you'll see that they're pointed at different directions, so that that's going to allow for different light to come through at different points of time in the year. This picture is channel 2. So this is rock 2, and that's rock 3. Look back here, you'll see the spiral petroglyph engraved there on the wall. And this photo was taken by Dr. Robert Marks of the U.S. Geologic Service when he was working in Palo Alto. If you've heard of the, how come I can't think of the name of it, but he and his wife, Evelyn Billow, do a lot of rock art work. So it's Rupestrian Cyber Services. This is a picture that was taken when Dr. Rolf Sinclair, Anna Safair, and a couple of other folks were doing the research up here. And the photographer is laying on his back, looking up, and you can see these 2 cracks. You see that? And so you're going to get light coming down through these cracks onto this spiral petroglyph that I'm going to show you in just a minute. But this is what is going to cause these 2 different light daggers. And then we'll talk about this shadow line a little bit later. This is a picture out of National Geographic. And basically it shows you the patterning of the sun from the summer solstice, the equinoxes, and then the winter sun. And they give the same, they give you a stylized picture of it over here on the right-hand side. I'm going to show you the same thing as we go through. So Andy Odell and I were up there on June 19th to observe the moon pattern. And that was June 19th, 2005, or that time frame. It might have been, I think it was earlier than that. I think it was in the 1990s. And Andy was the one who took these pictures. I do want to point out right here, can you see that there is a petroglyph right there? I just clicked the button accidentally. So this is the second picture. I'll go back. There's the first picture. And then we have these pictures about every 30 seconds. These are about 2 minutes apart. And so the light dagger comes right down through the center of the spiral petroglyph. Notice that this crack right here actually serves as a reference for where that light dagger goes. And that's a natural crack. That's not human made. And so this is the summer solstice. And you can see the light dagger coming right through the center. And the width of that, prior to one of those rocks moving, the width of that was approximately the width of a nickel. Now, I'm going to go back, and here is the spiral, this petroglyph over here on the right, excuse me, on the left. And what, I pushed the button too quick. What happens is that this is on the equinox. Now, if you were watching this on the equinox on September 1st, you wouldn't see any light coming through there. On September 2nd, 3rd, 4th, nothing. September 20th, nothing. September 21st, bang, there it is. That light dagger comes right through the middle of that small spiral petroglyph. So this is marking the equinox. I also want to point out, you can see it right here. You see this little groove right there? Well, it turns out, and I know this because I said to Dr. Rolf Sinclair that he created a lot of hooflaw, and that's actually the word I used, because I couldn't see that groove. It shows up on film, but the eye doesn't see it. And this is going to be very important when we talk about the moon in a couple of minutes. Then what ends up happening is that the light dagger that created the sun, the summer solstice sun coming right through the center, is this line right here. It's off to the right as we look at it, the left side of the petroglyph. And this light dagger over here is the equinox marker. So this is the winter solstice. What happens is that the light pattern on this petroglyph changes every day, except when you're in the region of time, the 4 or 5 days before or after the solstices. So this marks almost every day of the year. I want to talk about the moon a little bit. And we talked earlier about the orbit of the Earth, about the sun. And what we see is the movement of the sun along our horizon. But keep in mind, that's because the Earth is moving, not because the sun is moving. So here is the summer solstice sun right here. And then here's the marker for a winter solstice sun. Well, what ends up happening is that this is the moon, the white dots are the moon. And so here's the moon at its shortest or its minimum migration. And that's the northern minimum of the moon. And 14.5 days later, the moon will be right here, because the moon migrates across the horizon as well. We don't often notice that because we live indoors. So what ends up happening then is it takes 14.5 days to get back to this other side. And when it comes back, it's just a smidgen further north, and then it's a smidgen further south, and a little bit more north, a little bit more south, these each being a month, which is where we get the word month. And so what ends up happening is that the moon is moving back and forth, and in 4.5 years, then the moon will line up with the sun motion. And this is when we have the greatest number of eclipses. So when the moon lines up with this point, then it will then, if it's a full moon here, it's possible to have a full full solar eclipse. And then the moon will be over here, but it will be a new moon, so you would not see an eclipse. What happens is anything that's in this area here, you can't tell the difference whether it's caused by, if it's a marking of the moon or if it's a marking by the sun, because it could be either one of them. But if it's beyond the sun, then it's more likely to be a marking of the moon, though it's possible it could be a marking of the sun. And yes, folks, the Hopi do mark the positions of the stars. They don't talk about it. I have asked several very knowledgeable Hopi elders, and they've said, well, that's our information. That's not to be shared with others. So that basically told me to shut up. But what ends up happening is that the moon continues to move beyond the solstice positions, and in another 4.5 or more years, 9.3 years, it gets to the maximum position. And that's about 5 degrees further north and 5 degrees further south of the sun's position, the solstice positions. So what ends up happening is we go back to this site, and Andy Odell was standing right here. Okay. And now this side is to the east. So you're looking at this rock wall. This rock here is facing to the east. So imagine the full moon rising, and then the full moon rises and it casts a light shadow line across this edge right there. You with me on that? So the moon is reflecting sunlight. So it's actually, we'll call it moonshine, but it's reflecting or casting a light shadow line onto the petroglyph. This is the full moon rise of the northern maximum lunar excursion back in the 1990s. And this photo was taken by Dr. Rolf Sinclair that I spoke of earlier. I was fortunate to work with him on this project. And there actually is a groove that goes right along here. And it's even more difficult to see than the other groove, the one that comes out of the center. And this then is a marker of that northern maximum lunar excursion. If we wait 9.3 years, then the full moon will throw a light shadow line right into this groove. But since it's within the lunar minimum is in between the, excuse me, I had to burp there. It's in between the solstices. What ends up happening is that we can use the position of the sun when it is at the same location as the lunar minimum. We simply need to know the declination of each object. And so this picture was actually taken by the Light Dagger project, what do they call it? Sun Dagger project. And it fits right into that groove that I showed you earlier. So this site not only marks the movement of the sun on an annual basis, but it marks the movement of the moon on a 18.6 year basis. Is that all? No, because we're going to climb down from Fajada Butte and go for a long walk over to CASA RINCONADA. Now, these are two pictures that I got from chacoarchive.org. It's a public access site. You can go get it. And this picture was taken in 1896. This is CASA RINCONADA. Well, you can tell it's pretty well collapsed. This picture was taken in 1904, a little bit more clarity, better photography at that point. And so even with this picture, you can tell, wait a minute, they had to do a lot of rebuilding. And so what ends up happening is I want you to keep these pictures in mind as we continue through CASA RINCONADA, because here's a picture of it after it's been reconstructed. Now, one thing I want you to notice is that here's the hilltop here, and this is on top of the hill, and this land right around here, that's all fill that was brought in by Native people. This was not brought in by the Park Service. And so this was intentionally created on top of a mesa, on top of a very small hill, I should say. And then there was soil that was brought in. This direction is south, and that direction is north. And if I keep looking north, you know what I run into? That's Pueblo Bonito that we looked at earlier. So that's Pueblo Bonito right there. This is the collapsed rock, falling, threatening rock if you've ever been to Chaco. This is an older picture, but it gives you a very clear understanding of what's going on, in that this is the north side, this is the south side, and it's on a true north-south axis crossed with an west to east, the way my marker was going. Here's a window right there that there was only a small corner of that window that was present when this CASA RINCONADA was rebuilt. Secondly, you can see that there is a way, and I have done this, you can't do it anymore. You can climb down through here and come out in this little tunnel through this walkway, and then suddenly appear in the middle of the CASA RINCONADA as if it was magic. These are two of the posts that would hold up the KIVA roof. The other two, there's one here and then one over on this other side. These are probably foot drums. And by that, I mean, they would have stretched animal skins over them, and then they could have beaten them with them, either with a drumstick or perhaps with their feet, in order to create sound. So a chap named Dr. Ray Williamson, who is a close friend of mine, I work with him. He is part of the board at the Society for Cultural Astronomy of the American Southwest. And he did a lot of research here. And what he found is that the light coming through this window on the summer solstice directly lines up with this cubby. And if you look at this, you'll see that there are some cubbies that are up a little bit higher, and then there's only 3 cubbies that are lower. And so that's the picture of the light coming into this cubby. And I forget what materials, if any, were in there. So Ray said, well, obviously this is a summer solstice marker. Well, there's one thing Ray forgot about, and that is this post right there is directly in line between the window that the light comes in and where the portal or the cubby is for creating this lighting of that cubby. And so he got raked over the coals for it. He says, oh my gosh, I made a mistake. He apologized and so forth. But then he went back and he started looking at this site more carefully. And this is a drawing that was done by a Tewa Indian. But the point I'm getting at is that Ray looked at it very carefully, and he was the one who measured the different axes, saw that it was right on true north, true south, meaning it was aligned astronomically, not magnetically. They didn't have compasses at that time. And he began to look at more of the geometry of the building itself and the fact that it has a very, very special placing. And he thinks that this is a very sacred site amongst the ancestral Chacoan people. Now, 2 things happen here. Number one, this yellow light is what this yellow line is what you saw with the summer solstice sun coming through the window and then hitting into one of these small cubbies. The same thing happens with the winter solstice, and the winter solstice is the this lower yellow line, and this was Ray had figured this out, but this drawing was made by Kirby Gerchaw. But the thing that Kirby did that Ray didn't was that Kirby looked at the moon, because the moon has a lot of significance within their culture. And sure enough, when the moon is at its northern maximum, it follows this pathway, whereas at its southern maximum, it follows that pathway. And the moon intersects at exactly the same point at going due west as it rises across the horizon through different openings. So this is a very likely a dedication, a shrine that was dedicated to the moon. Now you'll see those circles in there. Kirby Gerchaw actually drew those in there. Those are not on the ground, but it does point out the symmetry that's going on here. And one of the things that Greg Munson and I and a couple of other folks found when we were working at Mesa Verde, we think that the native people were using yucca fiber ropes as measurements. And so they could take a yucca fiber rope and mark it with painting or, you know, some coloring for different distances. And then you could use that rope to mark out a very accurate circle. And we think that they were actually created their own measurement system and used different ropes with different colors on them in order to mark consistent distances. I'm going to go a little bit further north of Chaco up to a place called Chimney Rock. And Chimney Rock is an incredible place because it's up at 8,300 or 8,500 feet. And one of the things that the archaeologists found when they're at this site is that there were a lot of bones that were coming from elk or deer or other large animals. Well, most of the people who were doing the building, or the, you know, the commoners and so forth, they were eating squirrels or rabbits or even mice and rats. They weren't eating elk. And so to have a large number of large mammal bones indicates that this site was probably being occupied by priests. And this site is within 3 days walk of Chaco. I probably ought to make that 4 days. But what ends up happening is down here, you have the two kivas. There's one kiva, there's a second kiva. And in the process, if you look through the middle of both those kivas, they line up right through there. And keep in mind that this is at about 8,300, 8,500 feet. So this is not a comfortable place to live. You got to bring all your food, all your water, and so forth into this site. Secondly, what ends up happening is that the moon on its furthest northern excursion comes right between Chimney Rock and Companion Rock, in line with the center of those two kivas that I just talked about. And this photo was taken by Ron Sutcliffe. Ron has done some exceptional work at Chimney Rock as well as at Chaco Canyon. And he is one that has really tracked down the lunar cycles and how different ancestral people have followed the lunar cycles. And I recommend his book, but I don't remember the title. This is also a picture from Ron Sutcliffe. And what ends up happening is that this is the northern maximum of the moon. So this is the northern maximum standstill. And you can see it just barely comes through Chimney Rock and Companion Rock, directly in line with the axes of the kivas I spoke about. This pathway right here, that is the summer solstice sunrise. So you'll never see the summer solstice sunrise through this passage there, only the northern maximum. And then this pathway is the southernmost standstill. So pretty clearly, this was a site that marks the observation of the moon. And the other interesting fact is that Chimney Rock was built at a time that Chaco was beginning to collapse. Not just beginning, it was in the process of collapsing. And so this likely was a site that was built because the priests, the shaman, the more elite were trying to maintain their power, and they were probably ascribing to the moon to help them in maintaining their cultural ways. We're going to go to Wupatki now. This is to the northeast of Flagstaff. I've spent a lot of time out here, but I'll try to make it quick today. This is a rock wall that was built in the 1100s. And as you can see, there's a small window right there. That's the middle window. You can see part of the sky through it. This is the north window. This is the south window. But because the south, each of these windows are at different angles, you can't see through them from one point, either on the front side or the back side. So I'm standing on the east, looking towards the west. Now I'm standing in the west, looking towards the east, and I want you to notice something. Look at this horizon. It's very difficult to measure the change in days or the change in the position of where the sun is rising if you have a flat horizon, because there's no reference marker. So what ends up happening is that these windows, there's the south window, the middle window, and the north window. Those windows serve as reference markers. This is the south window. And what I should have done, I didn't think of this 30 years ago, is to have been on the west side looking to the east. I took these pictures from the east side looking to the west. But each of these windows is about 30 inches in length through the wall, and then about 5 inches across the opening. So it's a rather small portal for the movement of the sun that we're going to see in a few minutes coming through there. And what's typical is that there are 2 or 3 rocks in the base of the wall, but there's only one rock that goes through the entire distance. This is a picture of a different window. And what you can see here is there's a light shadow line on a day where the sun has risen. This would actually be to the south. So this was I probably took this in November, or perhaps, earlier than that. But the point I want you to understand is that this light shadow line changes every day during the year, except when you're close to the solstices. So you can actually use the change in the light shadow line to predict, to anticipate when the sun will arrive in the middle, when the sun will be in the middle, when the sun will disappear from the opposite side. That anticipation is incredibly important. So I was fortunate to spend the night a couple of times out at Kraken Rock at Wupatki National Monument. You can see the moon there. Venus is hiding somewhere, but I got up very, very early and watched the sun come through the south window. This is sunrise in the south window, and that was on October 31st. So you can see the position of the sun. This is clearly marking something. Now, I could go back on February 2nd. It's normally pretty dang cold, but it's the same. The sun would be in the same place on February 2nd as it is on October 31st, because both of them are cross quarter dates. Both of them, the sun is at the same azimuth. I came back using the same camera on May 1st and took another picture. This is the middle window, and this middle window then ends up being the sun is in the same position. But now it's May 1st and August 6th. And the first picture I ever took was of the summer solstice. This is the summer solstice here. What I didn't mention is that, let me go back for just a minute. If the sun came up in this corner, it would take about 4 days, 5 days to the center. So about anywhere 9 to 10 days for it to move across this width. But for the summer solstice, it takes about 20 days to go from this corner here to the center before you can, then the sun stops, never goes beyond that point, and then it changes its direction. Now that change in direction is going to be very important, as I'll explain in just a minute. Looking around the site, I also found this petroglyph, and I was intrigued by it because I'd been looking at some petroglyphs and I thought, golly, that looks like it might be a clan symbol. So I did a presentation on this at the 5th International Conference on Cultural Astronomy. It's run through Oxford University in England. And what ends up happening is that I presented this from the point of the water clan, because I was told by several Hopis that this was the water clan. And the chap after I presented, this chap by the name of Steve McCluskey, Dr. McCluskey, came up to me and says, "Bryan, good presentation, but that's not the water clan. That's a sand clan." And I went, "I don't think so." So he sends me a reference to publications by Jesse Fuchs in like 1895. Excuse me. So these publications were in 1895, and sure enough, this is marked as Sand Clan. I go, oh my gosh, what's going on? Well, I end up going back to Alexander Stephan's book, Hopi Journals, and Alexander Stephan was one of 2 Anglos ever to be inducted into Hopi society. He grew up with the Hopi. His uncle who raised him was actually the person that started Keams Canyon. And the short of the long is that in one sentence out of 1,000-page book, there's a statement that the Sun Clan and the Sand Clan merged. I think I said that wrong. The Water Clan and the Sand Clan merged. And so basically, both Steve McCluskey and I were right. We just got to the same point on a different road. That, of course, you all will recognize as the French Poodle clan, right? No, it's not. That's probably the Antelope clan. And so this is out on the very northeast side of Wupatki National Monument. Now, if you stand up by the solar calendar wall that I've showed you, and you walk just to the south, look down off of a cliff, you'll see this kiva. And this kiva was excavated by Dr. Harold Colton, the founder of the Museum of Northern Arizona. And based upon the artifacts here, he said that this was a kiva. And one of the things you'll note is that this is more of a square shaped, but you get kivas that are round in the eastern pueblos and square or rectangular in the western pueblos. At any rate, what ends up happening is that this is very, very close to this site. There's easy access to it from the solar calendar wall. And I believe that this was a site where the shamans or the priests or the elders would come, would pray, would sing, would have some sort of ceremony, some gathering time, and then would go observe the rise of the sun through the windows. All of this brings me back to share with you that via this picture, this was taken by Edwin Curtis, and this is the Hopi going through one of their dances in the kiva. You can see the opening of the kiva right up here. And so this is a picture of a picture. But what it reminds me to tell you is that you need to know more about the culture than you do about the astronomy to understand what the people are doing. Cultural astronomy is really about cultural. It's about cultural ethnography and so forth. So coming back to what does this mean? Here's the south window. You can just see the opening there. And the sun rises in that south window on October 31st, which is the beginning of the Wupatki, which is something I described earlier with filmer Kiwanyama's pictures, his painting, but also then February 2nd. And February 2nd is the Puwamuya. Well, what I want to begin to emphasize here is that the cross-quarter dates are the times at which there is a transition from the men's ceremonies to the women's ceremonies. And the men's ceremonies are from November 1st to February. That's the winter time. And then from May 1st to August, that's the summer solstice time. So the men's ceremonies are the solstice times. The women's ceremonies are the equinox times. And there is always a ceremony on the cross-quarter date time period, which allows for the transition of the ceremonial cycle between the women and the men. So this is the big Puwamuya, and what essentially happens is that the native people, the Hopi, are in the kivas. They have a fire going, so it's warm, there's light. They plant seeds, normally beans, and those seeds are watered, so they begin to grow. And the time in which it's very cold, very dark, and nothing else is growing outside. So it's the return of life. It's the indication that spring is coming. And indeed, that's what the groundhog does as well. As we move along in time, this is May 1st. It's this window right here. And this is a time at which people would have been preparing to plant. They weren't necessarily planting, but they were going out. And keep in mind that now the soil is warming, and in order for the seeds to germinate, they need to have enough warmth, enough heat in the soil to stimulate the enzymes to start germinating in the seeds. Then this is the northern window, which is the summer solstice. And this window then indicates the time at which the Katsinas will go back home. It's called the Nimaniwa, and the Katsinas will go to a high point, not necessarily the San Francisco peaks, because the Hopi, the Puebloan folks that were up by what is now Lake Powell, think of Navajo Mountain as a place where the spirits would go. So the other thing that happens is very similar to what happens for us, is that on December 21st, it is a solstice. That's the shortest day. And the first day that you can tell whether or not you can tell that the sun has changed position, that it is coming back, is on December 25th. Now, that wasn't lost on the Pope Gregory. I think it was Pope Gregory the Sixth some time ago. But the point I'm getting at is that we in our society do not celebrate the solstice. We celebrate Christ's birth, but it's really the return of the sun. The same thing happens here in that the Hopi will be watching through this window, and they would have noticed the change in the sun's trajectory going back to the south. That's when the announcement is made that the Neman should begin preparation. That's June 25th. Then you go into 10, 12 days of preparation. So you're in early July. You begin the ceremony that goes on for 16 days or so. And what happens now is the Katsinas have gone back to the peaks, and then they return as the wind, bringing the clouds that allow for rain from the monsoons. So the Hopi have actually connected astronomical events with climate events. And those climate events are very important because that's what provides the water for their crops to grow. Finally, we come back to this petroglyph I showed you earlier. This is on the winter solstice. And remember that this is the water and sand clan. This is likely the antelope clan. But what has happened is that this light shadow line began moving across this rock around Halloween, and it comes over and it just touches the side of the water sand clan petroglyph, but it never crosses it. And so as this happens, then this is December 21st, then this light begins to retreat. Well, what ends up happening is that the water sand clan is responsible for some parts of every ceremony that was taking place on the February 2nd, the Puamuya, the planting time, and the summer solstice. And in fact, they were called the water clan because they carried water to the dancers. So this tells us that what's happening is that the political and religious power gets passed through these ancestral Puebloan people on a time schedule relative to the movement of the sun and the moon, not necessarily related to a calendar system like we have. I've got just a little bit left, and if Ellie is here, Ellie Large, I think you'll enjoy this because, first of all, this was a map of the Pulaquapi Trail. It was drawn by James Burkett, who has passed away, but he was a history professor at NAU and gave presentations up on the Hopi land. And when he was talking about what he was finding in terms of this trail and movement and so forth, the native people were talking back and forth, Pulaquapi, Pulaquapi. And so he learned from them about this trail. Well, what happens is, here is the Oraibi, Walpi, Awatavi. If you know of Awatavi, it's the only place that there was been a civil war amongst the Hopi. And this is a trail then that comes south down into the Verde Valley, and it continues south all the way to Durango, Durango, Mexico, but also splits off, goes through Prescott over to the Gulf of Baja, possibly the Pacific Ocean. And we find spondella shells along this route, but we also find turquoise that's been placed found at different places. So this was probably a trade route as well as a migration route. Well, I looked at several of these sites. Some of them have astronomical events going on that I'm not going to get into, but I do want to go to this one. This is the one out by Stoneman Lake. And this is a large etched spiral petroglyph in a basalt boulder. And as you can see, there's a little shadow dagger here. And if you were to go up above on the rock, off of the screen up above, there's a nubbin of rock that sticks up that causes that shadow. Well, what ends up happening is that this shadow goes right next to this other spiral petroglyph down here below, and the shadow dagger goes right through the center of the spiral petroglyph. And then as it continues, you'll notice that it's coming up towards the very edge, but this happens in a lot of places along this migration, this light shadow migration, is that you have the tip of the shadow in one groove and the tip of the light in a second groove. Well, then it ends up coming off, and the light shadow line comes down across the top side of the petroglyph down into an opening. And notice that here is that petroglyph, that second petroglyph I was talking about, and this trail through here. Well, a couple of things are happening here, folks. What I've just shown you is what happens at the equinox. And the equinox is the women's ceremony time. So the Mamzara usually happens in the spring, and the women are welcoming back the earth, welcoming back the fertility of the land, the growth of plants, and the preparation for planting and so forth. Then in the fall, the same pattern will happen, and that's related to the Lalakantu, and that is part of the women's rites of, I think it's part of the women's rites of passage, based upon a conversation with Barton Wright, who was the curator of archaeology and anthropology at the Museum of Northern Arizona for numerous years. Probably was the best, had the best knowledge of Hopi people of any Anglo at the time that he lived. Well, a couple of other things happened. And I'll go to this drawing. I don't have all the pictures that I have the pictures, I couldn't find them. But what ends up happening is here's the equinox shadow dagger that comes along through the center. Then that would be the September 21st and March 21st. The fall cross quarters date, the shadow line falls right along the upper right-hand edge of this, and the spring cross quarter date falls right along the bottom here. The summer solstice is not marked on this site, but the winter solstice, and this was found by Barry Malpas, the winter solstice cuts right along the bottom here. So what you're seeing is this one site has numerous different alignments with it. But in the process of doing this research, I had Todd Bostwick join me, and Todd's an exceptional archaeologist, and we watched the light shadow pattern, and then he went, my gosh, it's going into the crevice. That looks to me as if it may be a channel for a out-of-the-body experience. And he started beginning to talk about shamans having trances, having different out-of-the-body experiences, perhaps living in different places, or different, having the capacity to travel between earthly life and other life. And he said that this looked as if it could be a shaman's trail going then into this crevice. Well, what's interesting is that all of these light patterns, the cross-quarter dates and the equinox, they all go into that point. And so this could well be a marker of some out-of-body experience. Well, let me share with you very quickly that we know from Pueblo mythology, ethnology, their architecture, there's very, very, very strong evidence that the Puebloan people marked the movement of the sun and the moon. The knowledge of the sun provided seasonal time. Knowledge of the moon provided ceremonial time. That's every ceremony within Hopi is related to the moon. The ceremonies generally begin with the first crescent of a new moon. Now that's changed a little bit because of the work cycle that the Hopis and other native people find themselves in now. So there are numerous sacred places, and many of these sacred places may have been used for both astronomical observations as well as for some ceremonial purpose. As I said earlier, we know that the Hopis use constellations, but they only use them, to my knowledge, in the Wupatki ceremony, and the Wupatki ceremony is no longer being practiced amongst the Hopi. I would conclude then with one statement, and that is that religion and science really come from the same root. That is, how do you explain that which is otherwise not explainable? And so I believe that there is, a God, but I don't get so fervent about it that I spend every day worrying about it. But I also believe that there's science, and that science helps us understand the different natural processes, and that religion provides us comfort when we have different struggles in our lives. So I honestly believe that religion and science share the same root. They just use different ways of interpreting their information. And so with that, thank you very much. And I will turn my video off. Thank you, Richard.
Oh, thank you, Brian. That was extraordinary.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Oh, you're most welcome. So if folks have comments or questions, why, I'll be glad to take them, unless your name is Eleanor Large, in which case you already know everything I said. Ellie and I know each other from the Society for Cultural Astronomy of the American Southwest.
I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you very, very much.
You're welcome.
Well, thanks again, Brian. And with that, I guess we'll conclude the meeting.
All righty.
Until next time.
We'll Zoom next month.
So,
Okay, you take care.
all right.
Later.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Goodbye, all.